Good evening. Welcome back. Appreciate you being here. Go ahead and open up your Bibles, Matthew 27, and we're going to look at the jump off here again. Look at the last of the questions that Pilate asked during the trial of Jesus. We have already looked at the questions so far. Are you the king of the Jews? And we understand that certainly in every sense of the question, he was the king of the Jews. And then at the charges, if you remember, at the charges, Pilate was amazed that he gave no response. So his question was, do you not hear how many things that they testify against you? And then he turns to the crowd. You remember Pilate turns to the crowd and he asks, who do you want me to release for you? Barabbas or Jesus? Then, of course, the follow-up to that we concluded with last week. What then shall I do with Jesus? Certainly a question we all are faced with on a daily basis. We're going to turn our attention and stay in Matthew chapter 27 and look at verse 23 as Jesus, in his trial, I suppose, receives a testimony from Pilate, somewhat interesting, fascinating to me in verse 23. The next question is, what evil has he done? Luke records, or Matthew rather, records it this way. And he said, why, what evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. You flip over and you look at Mark's account of that, as we have been in Mark chapter 15. And I believe we're looking around verse 14. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. And then let's turn to Luke, because Luke includes just a couple of these questions, but this is one, interestingly enough, that he does include in Luke chapter 23. We find it in verse 22 with an interesting addition. A third time he said to them, why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him. I find it fascinating in verse 22 that Luke, as we understand it, begins verse 22 by saying a third time. This is the third time that Pilate told the crowd, I find no guilt in him. 3 different times. You remember Luke records for us that he sent, since Herod was in the area, he sent Jesus off to be tried by Herod, and Herod sent him back. Nothing worthy of condemnation. Pilate gives the same sort of testimony that he has done nothing deserving death. 3 times he said, I find no guilt in him. So our question, why? What evil has he done? As we look at that question, the obvious answer is none, right? I mean, he hasn't done a single thing. Certainly not a single thing to deserve death, but he hasn't done a single thing worthy of any sort of criticism or punishment whatsoever. But at least in my mind, as I think about it, that very concept that Jesus hasn't done anything deserving death, that is essential, isn't it? I mean, that detail where Pilate says for the third time, look, for the third time, I find no guilt in him. That detail is so essential to salvation, isn't it? Since Jesus, the obvious answer is that he hasn't done anything, certainly deserving death. It solidifies not just our faith, but it solidifies the salvation that God can and does give to humanity. And I say that and I follow it up immediately by saying, I know that God can save whoever he wants to save. But because Jesus had done no guilt, what that allowed him to do was to become that perfect sacrifice. Doesn't it? Peter, and look, we'll look at a few passages here, but in 1 Peter, we've looked at it several times, and I don't regret that by any stretch of the imagination. Many of you probably have it memorized, but look and consider what he writes, 1 Peter chapter 1. Knowing that you were ransomed, verse 18, from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of the anointed of Christ, of like a lamb without blemish or spot. The precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. Now, immediately our mind races back to the Old Testament, doesn't it? Rightfully so. What Jesus in his perfect life and complete innocence and nothing worthy of death, what it does is it allows him to be a sacrifice. Because if you go back, right, if you go back to the Old Testament, the details are there is that it has to be a perfect lamb, right? It can't be a lamb without it has to be without defect. No spot, no blemish. There's nothing wrong with that sacrifice. So as Jesus, our question, what evil has he done? Since Jesus has done no evil, he can be that sacrifice because he is the lamb without blemish. He is the lamb without spot. He is the one that is completely perfect in every single way. What evil has he done? I find no guilt in him. That fact allows Jesus to be the sacrifice. That gives us hope. It allows Jesus to be not just a sacrifice, but it also allows him to do the sacrificing. Now, follow me real quick. It allows him to be the one sacrificing. Nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down on my own accord. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, follow me with my thought. A little crazy, but we'll get there. Verse 15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, not imperfections, with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. I find no guilt in him, Pilate said. I find yet without sin. There is no guilt. So Jesus is allowed to be, he is permitted, he allows himself to be sacrificed, but he is also the one that lays himself down on the sacrifice. You remember in Genesis chapter 22, Abraham and Isaac go up Mount. Father, here's the wood. Here's the fire. Where's the ram? Where's the sacrifice? The Lord will provide. Jesus goes up the mountain, carrying the wood and himself being the sacrifice. So he lays himself down. He lays down his own life as the sacrifice because, and he can do that because he is completely perfect in every single way. I find no guilt in him. So we come back in Hebrews chapter 4, follow me, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. Jesus is the high priest. He's the sacrifice. So as we enter Old Testament, as we enter into the most holy place, the high priest can go once a year. Jesus is our great high priest, able to sympathize with our weaknesses, yet he has no sin. He enters the most holy place as the high priest. He enters the most holy place as the sacrifice. He enters the most holy place as God. So when we think about Jesus and his sacrifice, I find no guilt in him. Jesus, as he comes into the most holy place, as our great high priest, he is everything. He is the most holy place. As God, the sacrifice, and the high priest, he is all in all. How? Why? All of that comes back to the statement, the confession that Pilate made, I find no guilt in him. It'll give you chills, won't it? What Jesus has done because he is perfect. What Jesus was permitted to do because he is perfect. And building on that, let's take that to another level. Let's put another layer on top of that. As Jesus begins his ministry, in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew, you remember that statement in chapter 5. Verse 17, it says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them, to fill them up, to complete them, perhaps. So Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets. He came to fulfill, obviously, the synecdoche part used for the whole. Jesus came to fulfill the Old Testament. How was Jesus able to fulfill the Old Testament? Well, first of all, he kept the Old Testament perfectly. No flaws, no sins, no imperfections, no transgressions. And on top of that, he fulfills the old law perfectly by becoming what the old law couldn't fully do. The blood of bulls and goats is never sufficient to take away the sins of man, but what is? It's the sins of man. It's the sacrifice of man. But not just that, it's the sacrifice of God himself. Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets. And he was able to do that by being himself God in the flesh, laying down his own life and taking away the sins of the world. Because he was perfect. Because of what Pilate says here in Luke chapter 23 and verse 22. I find no guilt in him. Herod finds no guilt in him. Jesus is perfect. And the question is, why? What evil has he done? He hasn't done any. But we need to thank God every day that he didn't do any, but yet he still went to the cross. Our first question, Why? What evil has he done? So now we depart, okay? Where we depart from the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we look at John because he's kind of his own, he does his own thing. Most Johns do their own thing, don't they? And John focuses primarily on the end of Jesus's life. But John gives us, as we look at the trial of Jesus, John gives us a different glimpse, a couple of different questions that aren't recorded for us in the Synoptic Gospels, which I've saved for the end. And one of them that Pilate asked in John chapter 18, if you want to flip over there, again, nowhere else in the gospel accounts, but in John chapter 18, beginning in verse 37, Pilate asks this question. So you are a king, Jesus answered. You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. The question that Pilate asked in verse 38, he said to him, what is truth? What is truth? That's the question. What is truth? That's a question that society, us, generations for probably forever will wrestle with that question is what is truth? And we live in a day and age where there is no certain objective truth, that it is this fluid concept and it changes from day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute. But stay with me in the book of John, thinking about this question, what is truth? And I think we're going to arrive at a somewhat obvious answer. So Jesus, we call it the high priestly prayer of Jesus in John chapter 17. And it's divided nicely for us. Every preacher loves this into 3 sections. He prays for himself. He prays for his disciples, that small band of people who were following him in that day. And then he takes time and prays for those who will follow Jesus because of that small band of people who are following him. But as he is praying for that small band, he says this in verse 17 of chapter 17. He says, sanctify them in truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake, I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth, so that they may be made holy in or by the means of truth. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. That they may also be sanctified, made holy in truth. I don't like leaving anybody hanging. Let me connect a dot. If you want to put a dash, a hyphen, and write a verse beside this, John chapter 1 would be a great one to put in there. In the beginning, verse 1, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh, skip on down, and dwelt among us. Look at another passage with me. In John chapter 8, staying in John. We're going to camp out in John for a little bit. What is truth? Pilate asked. Verse 31, John chapter 8. So Jesus said to the Jews in John chapter 8, we're going to come back to this. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book of John. And I believe it's one of those pivotal moments in Jesus' ministry. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Lock that in your brain, and let's keep reading. They answered him, we are offspring of Abraham, and we have never been enslaved to anyone, which every time I read it, this is a side note, free information, I find comical. Don't you? We've never been enslaved to anyone. How about Egypt? How about Babylon? How about 70 years in captivity? How is it that you say we will be free? Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. Listen, so if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Verse 36. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Set free by the truth. Set free by the son. I love it. Maybe a little bit more bluntly, if you're not following my train of thought here. John chapter 14, verse 6, and Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Pilate's question, what is truth? Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Every single time, every single context, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. What is truth? This is truth. So as Pilate stares Jesus in the eyes and maybe flippantly asks, what is truth, walking off? The harsh reality is that truth was right there in front of him. And he had no idea. The embodiment, the personification of truth. What is truth? When the world says that there's no standard and that there's no such thing as right or wrong, and it's up to each individual, it's not. It's just not. It's up to Jesus because he's the standard. He is truth. He is the word. That's the first question that John records for us, not in the synoptic gospels. Now, the second one is a little bit scary as I think about it. Recorded in John chapter 19. If you continue the saga of Jesus's mockery of a trial, beginning in verse 9, he entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, you will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? The question is, where are you from? Now, Pilate may be thinking, where are you from? As in when somebody comes up to you and says, where are you from? Or they come up to Brittany and say, you're not from around here. You've got an accent. Where are you from? North Carolina. Maybe that's what Pilate's asking. And Jesus, we know, like, if you look at Matthew chapter 2, there's two places where Jesus could say that he's from, and both of those fulfilling prophecy. In Matthew chapter 2, Jesus, the King of the Jews, was to be born in Bethlehem. Where are you from? He could say Bethlehem. Fulfilling prophecy. He was to be born in Bethlehem. He was born in Bethlehem, the city of David. Where are you from? Matthew chapter 2, as the chapter winds up. He was called back out of Egypt. And he left to go and to live and to grow up in Nazareth so that he might be called a Nazarene, fulfilling prophecy. So Jesus could very well answer the question as to where are you from? He could say, well, I'm from Bethlehem, or I'm from Nazareth. But it's interesting that Jesus remains silent, isn't it? He doesn't give an answer. Where are you from? Jesus gave him no answer. But Jesus does give us an answer, and he had already given the Jews an answer as to where he was from. And maybe this question, this is a side note, maybe this question stems from Herod's wife. You remember Herod's wife comes out and says, have nothing to do with this innocent, this righteous man, for I've suffered much because of him today. Maybe that's where it comes from. Nonetheless, he's a little nervous. Where are you from? The answer Jesus gives in John chapter 8, I told you we're going to come back to it. He gives these answers as to where he was from. John chapter 8 and verse 16, he says this, spiritually speaking. Yet even if I do not judge, my judgment is true. Even if I do judge, my judgment is true. For it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. Where are you from? And we could add to that verse 26 as well. Where are you from? Jesus' answer is, I am from the Father. Now, the Jews obviously understood, as we understand it today, when he says, I am from the Father, he's talking about God. I am from the Father, not a father. I'm from the Father. Another answer Jesus gives, if we continue reading in John chapter 8. So the Jews, in verse 22, so the Jews said, will he kill himself since he says, where I am going, you cannot come? He said to them, you are from below. I am from above. You are of this world. I am not of this world. Where are you from? Pilate asked. The first answer Jesus gives this crowd is, I'm from the Father. The second answer he gives this crowd is, I am from above. The conclusion, I am not of this world. He gives one more answer here in John chapter 8 to Pilate's question, where are you from? In verse 42. Jesus said to them, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God. And I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Where are you from? He gives three answers. And I can't, as I'm reading chapter 8, I can't help but to wonder, is Jesus getting more and more blatantly and obvious in saying, God is my Father and I am deity? Where are you from? I'm from the Father. I am from above, the Father above. I am from God, the Father above. I just wonder. they didn't quite get it, did they? So Pilate on Jesus' trial asked the same question, where are you from? Most of the time when people ask me, where are you from? I'll say Marshall County. Or now I've started to say Evansville. It hurts a little bit, but I'll say Evansville. But really, where are we from? I'm going to end with this passage in Hebrews, a passage I love, and I think it speaks volumes about Hebrews chapter 11. It's found in Hebrews chapter 11, but it says this beginning in verse 14. For people who speak thus, Hebrews 11:14, for people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Where are you from? That's what Pilate asked Jesus. But I think God asked us the same question. Where are you from? Yeah, we can say Evansville. But more importantly, we need to say, I'm from above. I'm seeking a homeland because I want God to be proud of me. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he is preparing for them a country. If that's not where you're headed tonight, then the invitation's yours as together we stand and as we sing.